Good evening, everyone. My name is Anna Deering, and I'm the Managing Director of the Society to Preserve the Millvale Murals of Moxo Vanka. I'm going to just do a short welcome, let a few more people join before we get to the main event, but we just wanted to say thank you for joining us for this second Vanka Murals Table Talk, researching the history of St. Nicholas Croatian Catholic Church. As many of you know, and I know that there's been a number of you who are joining us for the second time, we added this virtual program sort of out of necessity with the shutdown in place. But we're excited about the response to the first program, and we see this as just another way to share the Vanka Murals, to save and share the Vanka Murals with our growing community. So look for this to continue as part of our programming going forward. And this has really been the Society's mission since 1991 to save and share the murals, and we do so with the support of individuals like you coming to the murals, but also then attending presentations like this. So with that too, I want to say a special thank you to those who donated as part of their registration for today. We really appreciate your help at this time, helping us to keep this program going forward. Just before we do a couple more things, I do want to introduce you to introduce you to some of the features for tonight. So one of the great things about doing this as a webinar is that you do have the opportunity to interact with us. We do have, if you see it at the bottom, a Q&A function. There's a Q&A at the bottom of your screen. If you pull up the toolbar, we'd like you to post questions into that as they occur to you during the program. And we will use this. You can also, you'll see upvote questions, and that will help us to see what everyone's most interested in hearing about. It's likely we won't get to all the questions at the end of the program, but we'll do our best to do so. So please, if a question occurs to you, it's possible that we'll be able to answer them along the way, but if not, we'll try to build them into the Q&A at the end. I also wanted to make you aware of the fact that there's the chat function here. If you're having problems, you have a question, you can chat to the panelists, and we'll try to answer your question or address whatever needs you have at this time. So that is what we're working on today. So working with today, the Q&A and the chat. You'll be hearing from Matthew and Jeff in just a minute. But one of the things that we always do when people come to visit the murals is that we ask them how many people have been before. And so we're going to take a quick poll here. You'll see it come up on your screen. And if you can just take a minute to respond to the poll, we'd appreciate it. So we're doing really well. This is always interesting to see how fast these polls come up. So far we've heard from 47, 48, there we go. So I'm gonna say that probably most people have voted if they want to register a vote. And what we're seeing is that most of the people on the program tonight, and some more, but most on the people tonight have visited the church before, and but there's still 16% who haven't. So that's my cue to say that we are reopened for tours at the church once again, and it's on a limited schedule. Masks are required. but we'll be receiving advanced reservations. We'll also be a tour. So if you've been waiting to get involved or to see the murals, we hope to see you soon. Now I'm going to hand this over to Matthew Falcone. It's my pleasure to recognize the chair of our board, the Society's board. He's also a very active member of the preservation community and the president of Preservation Pittsburgh. So everyone, meet Matthew Falcone.
Hello. I just want to start us off by thanking the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, as well as the Heinz Endowment that are making this presentation possible, as well as who have made the research that you're about to see done by Jeff Slack possible. I also wanted to talk a little bit about my own involvement with the murals. And as Anna said, I am very active when it comes to historic preservation and also art conservation. And for me, the opportunity to be able to further preserve and further conserve something that is listed as on the National Register of Historic Places and recognized for holding national significance is particularly exceptional to me. And I'll say that a tour by Anna and a highlight of the murals themselves brought me to the attention of Moses in the Old Testament wall, which has a very personal affinity. And I'll say that the need for conservation work there and the continuance of conservation work that the Society is doing is absolutely necessary and needed. But without further ado, I would like to turn things over to Jeff Slack, who's our speaker for this evening. Jeff Slack is a preservation planner with a master's degree in historic preservation from Cornell University. He also created the first preservation fieldwork course at the University of Pittsburgh and is past chair of the Pennsylvania State Historic Preservation Board. He is also the founder of Time and Place Preservation Services. And Jeff, without further ado, take us away.
Thank you, Matthew, and welcome everyone. While many of you are familiar with St. Nicholas because of the murals that Maxo Vanka painted, tonight I'll be taking a broader look at the history of the church and arguing that there are at least 3 additional areas of significance. First, is its importance as the first Croatian church constructed in America. Second is the role of Father Albert Jagar in developing a mid-century modern campus. And third is a fresh assessment of architect Frederick Sauer. So that's me on the left and St. Nicholas on the right. For the past year, I've had the fortunate task of becoming very familiar with the history and condition of the church in order to develop long-term recommendations for its care. I'd like to thank the Society for entrusting me with this important task and for supporting my efforts at every turn. And I have a special gratitude for the staff and congregation of the church. Father Nick, Bob Ehrman, and other parishioners have generously helped me understand the significance and evolution of the church through their eyes. My work is part of a larger project funded by PHMC and the Heinz Endowments, as Matthew mentioned, and there are 3 broad goals. First, the conservation team will be returning to develop a strategy to conserve the remaining murals. To date, they have restored 12 of 25, and one of their early challenges is to determine how best to work 36 feet above the pews. Second, Clear Story will also be back to create a plan to illuminate these murals once they've been conserved. And my firm, Time and Place, is developing a holistic set of prioritized recommendations to care for the entire building. The document that I'm creating is known as a Historic Structure Report. This is a preservation planning tool that is based on archival research to detail why the building is historically significant and to understand how its use has evolved over time, and documentation on site to understand methods of construction, alterations over time, and current physical conditions. The building is obviously significant for its one-of-a-kind murals that cover almost every surface of the church's interior. This photo by Amy Fisher, looking from the choir loft toward the altar, provides a sense of the richness and vastness of Vanka's creativity. Vanka first arrived at St. Nicholas in 1937 at the invitation of the church's Croatian priest, Father Albert Žagar. That year, in an intense 2-month period, Vanka created the first 11 murals. He returned in 1941 and added 14 more, and came back again in 1951 to adorn the choir loft with a series of Christian symbols. At the time of their creation, the murals received broad media coverage that included Time and Life magazines, Harper's, and National Geographic. Critics called the murals the most extraordinary church murals ever painted and referred to them as tradition-shattering. In 1980, as Matthew mentioned, St. Nicholas was listed in the National Register of Historic Places and determined to have national significance, a designation given to only 1/10 of all National Register properties. Father Žagar largely gave Vanka free rein. The result was a brilliant blending of traditional and modern motifs that comment on the transition from the old world, especially during Croatia's occupation by the Nazis, to the new world and the social injustices encountered along the way. On the left is Mary, Queen of Croats, a presentation in heroic scale of the Madonna and Child, reflecting a Croatian peasant woman with traditional clothing, colors, and symbols. On the right is the angel Injustice with a bloodied sword and gas mask, a very modern scene never before conceived for a church. But as I mentioned, the church has significance beyond Vanka's murals, as the first Croatian church constructed in the United States. This is an image by the late photographer Clyde Hare for Pittsburgh History and Landmarks Foundation, showing St. Nicholas, and through the use of a very long lens, it also caught the twin spires of St. Augustine Church across the Allegheny River on 37th Street in Lawrenceville. As a result of extended political, economic, and social upheaval, more than 500,000 Croats left their country between 1880 and 1914. Many came to the United States, where workers were needed for post-Civil War reconstruction, unprecedented industrial growth, and westward expansion. Locally, they settled near factory jobs in places like Etna, Lawrenceville, and Millvale. Significant numbers also made their home in Allegheny City, today's North Side, where they established a tight-knit community along East Ohio Street that they called Mala Yaska or Little Yaska, after the district many were from in Croatia. In 1894, they formed the first Croatian parish in the country. A year later, led by Croatian priest Father Josip Boric, the congregation converted a house at 1546 East Ohio Street into a church. Fittingly, it was given the name St. Nicholas in honor of the patron saint of the Yaska district. In 1901, a larger church was constructed at 1326 East Ohio Street. It served the community for over a century before being demolished in 2013 after a protracted fight to save it. While very significant in its own right, it was not the first Croatian church in America built from the ground up. That distinction belongs to the subject of tonight's talk, St. Nicholas Croatian Catholic Church in Millvale. By 1898, Croatian priest Father Franjo Glanjaric had replaced Father Bosic at the church on East Ohio Street. Feeling that the congregation would not be well served by enlarging the converted house or building a new church on the narrow streets of Mala Yaska, he proposed a new site 1.25 miles away atop Bennett's Hill in nearby Millvale, which is shown by the red circle on the map. The lot atop Bennett's Hill was purchased in October 1899. A plan that accompanied the deed can be seen in the upper left corner. The lot contained a barn where services were initially held and a large wood frame farmhouse, which was moved to the west edge of the parcel so that the new church could be prominently sited. In July 1900, a parade of 800 people participated in the dedication of the cornerstone. 4 months later, the church was completed, and Father Glonjarich celebrated the first Mass on November 25th. At the bottom is an excerpt from a postcard from around 1910, showing Millvale looking toward the Allegheny River. It helps demonstrate the prominence of the site for which Father Glonjarich so strongly argued. While I don't think it was intentional, the siting of the church established an interesting juxtaposition of virtue versus vice, as the church faced the Bauerlein Brewery on Samples Hill, directly across the river valley formed by Gertie's Run. The new church, designed by Pittsburgh architect Frederick Sauer, was an impressive structure with rich details. It was constructed by the Murphy Brothers Construction Company, whose owners, Samuel and Charles Murphy, lived just blocks away on Butler Plank Road, today's Route 28. The church, however, looked notably different than the version of St. Nicholas that exists today, as the result of a devastating fire 2 decades after it was built. Sauer had designed a 3-story yellow brick church constructed in a Greek cross plan. 3 significant features made it grander and more refined than the later reconstruction. First, rising from the roof above the cross gables was a large octagonal dome capped by a cupola and crucifix. Visually, this would have added considerable height and mass to the church and would have allowed natural light to flood the interior. Inside, the experience of emerging from under the low choir loft into the dramatic vaulted expanse of the nave would have been magnified by the soaring sense of space under the dome. Second, the towers flanking the front entrance were a story shorter and were topped with lighter, more open arcades, which likely served as belfries. The shorter massing gave prominence to the taller, temple-like front of the church and would have further emphasized the verticality of the dome. And third, the church contained ornate, finely detailed opalescent stained glass windows. In simple terms, opalescent glass is a colored glass with a milky semi-opaque quality which allows light to pass through but does not permit one to see through. It is not known which studio crafted the windows, though Sauer was known to have worked with a number of firms, both locally and internationally. In 1902, Father Glonjarich proposed the construction of a Croatian school on the church grounds, but was met with opposition from parishioners, possibly due to concerns over existing construction debt. But when he put forth the idea of a more flexible assembly hall where local Croatian societies could meet, he gained approval. Sauer was again hired as the architect, and the firm of H. Schramm was the contractor. The hall was dedicated on October 12, 1902 by Reverend Glonjarich after a parade that lasted 2 hours. One example of a group that utilized the church hall was the singing society Nada, which is Croatian for hope. Groups like this existed not only to entertain, but also to educate and carry on the cultural traditions of their homeland. Here we have another picture of Nada, this time arranged at the front entrance to the church. It was forwarded by Michael Orban as a result of a crowdsourcing appeal by the society. Standing in the back row at the far right is his great-grandfather, Joseph Pavlikovich, who immigrated in 1898. Based on the date of the church and the arrangement of the stars on the American flag, we can date the photo to to the approximate period 1901 to 1912. Historic images like this are invaluable not only for documenting the social history of the church and the Croatian community, but also for showing details like these leaded windows that no longer exist. If you have similar images, we would love to see them, and you can email them to Anna at the email on your screen. You can also reach out to us now in chat. In 1916, under the leadership of Father Franjo Ransinger, the St. Nicholas Croatian Catholic Cemetery was dedicated just up the hill from the church on land in Reserve Township. Several thousand people attended the December 31st ceremony. In the early hours of Saturday, March 26, 1921, a fire in the church was discovered by the driver of a bakery wagon. By the time the Millvale Fire Brigade was on scene, the fire was out of control. An additional alarm that brought Engine Company 48 from across the river was not enough to save the church. It appears that the fire may have originated in the attic, resulting in the collapse of the ceiling and the central dome onto the first floor. Father Josip Soric, who then headed the church, lost no time. Within 24 hours, he celebrated Easter next door in the church hall, and in just over a year, he led the dedication of the rebuilt church on May 30th, 1922. Frederick Sauer was hired again to lead the effort, which was hastened by the ability to reuse the exterior walls. In these two photos, you can see the absence of the central dome, the taller towers, which I suspect were created in an effort to compensate for the visual loss of the dome, and the simple textured clear glass windows, which was all that could be afforded for the next 20 years. In 1931, Father Albert Jagar became pastor of St. Nicholas. During his early years, the Croatian-born priest was forced to focus on financial matters, including the avoidance of a sheriff's sale to settle unpaid debts, largely resulting from the fire. Aside perhaps from Father Glonjaric, who had the vision to establish the parish, Father Jagar is arguably the pastor who had the greatest impact on the evolution of St. Nicholas. For almost 4 decades, he brought a uniquely modernist perspective to an otherwise unassuming immigrant church. Modernism, in brief, during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, was a movement in art, architecture, and other aspects of society that did not rely on traditional precedents. It was a response in part to new technologies, urbanization, and war. In 1937, as part of his long-term vision for the betterment of the church and its campus, he began his collaboration with Maxo Vanka, whose art effortlessly weaved the traditional with the modern. The two are seen in the middle image reviewing concepts for the initial murals. In 1941, art critic Herbert Kubli observed that religion to these two men is a vital living thing, a continually surging experience interpreted in modern life. They are bringing all this to their murals and are tossing the dogmas of religious art into the ash can. I really like this quote because it acknowledges that the creation of the murals was a collaborative vision of Father Jagar and Vanka, and that they were undertaking something quite unprecedented. But the murals were just part of Father Jagar's plan. Having eliminated the church's debt by 1945, he set out to create a modern facility on Bennett's Hill to serve his Croatian congregation. The post-World War II campus from which he began planning consisted of just 3 buildings: the reconstructed church from 1922, the relocated 19th century farmhouse that had become the rectory, and the 1902 parish hall that had become the school. His first addition to the campus was a grotto to Our Lady of Lourdes, which was constructed in 1947 at the north edge of the property. Though no longer standing, it was a single-story stone structure featuring a central elevated statuary niche and a second statuary niche at ground level. In front, a circular stone fountain was recessed into a terrace of stone pavers. In 1950, the congregation celebrated its first half century. During that span, the church reported almost 4,800 baptisms and nearly 1,600 marriages, and the school population had grown to almost 200 students. This was a very active and growing congregation. Next, Father Jagar expanded the campus across Maryland Avenue, where a convent was built in 1954 to house the Sisters of St. Francis who taught at the parish school. It was constructed in a straightforward modern style of rectangular masses with a flat roof, and it combined brick and stone veneers along with glass block. It contained 13 rooms and a chapel, and today houses the offices of the Vanka Murals. 3 years later, a new rectory of similar modern form and materials was constructed just across the street, creating a gateway to the campus when coming up Maryland Avenue. In 1962, a new school was built on the site of the former school and rectory. Like the other recent additions, its design was clean and modern, and its buff brick exterior contributed to a cohesive aesthetic across the campus. In 1965, a rectangular buff brick garage was built in the northeast corner of the property to house the school bus that Father Jagar had strategically purchased years before to boost enrollment. The garage replaced an older structure that was demolished to make way for changes to nearby Route 28. Known as the Millvale Bypass, this realignment of Route 28 eliminated a circuitous network of surface streets that once snaked around the Millvale Trolley Barn. The construction also rerouted Maryland Avenue, as shown by the green arrow. In the lower right corner, one of the first cars to try the new highway zooms past well-wishers standing on Maryland Avenue. In the background is the rear corner of the rectory. Research has revealed that the grotto, convent, rectory, and school were built by McKees Rock's contractor Reinhold Witt and his sons Reinhold and Ernst. It appears likely that the firm also designed these post-war buildings. At a minimum, as can be seen in the caption for the left-hand photo, we know that the convent was designed by one of the Witt sons. Returning to the aerial photo from 1967, we see the fully built-out modern campus of St. Nicholas. Sadly, the collaborative pair responsible for this modern evolution could not enjoy it for long. Vanka drowned in a swimming accident in Mexico in 1963, and Father Jagar passed away in 1968. The third argument for the significance of St. Nicholas beyond the murals of Maxo Vanka is admittedly not as definitive and will require additional research. Scholars from the past half century have not looked very favorably upon architect Frederick Sauer, but they have tended to assess his career based on a limited handful of known works. Today, as a result of the plethora of electronic research tools, much more can be known about his body of work. Sauer was born in Heidelberg, Germany in 1860 and received a degree in architecture from the Stuttgart Technical School in Wittenberg in 1879. For 4 years, as part of his training, he worked as a stonecutter, bricklayer, and carpenter. In 1879, he arrived in Pittsburgh and initially worked for Edward M. Butts on the Western State Penitentiary before establishing his own firm in 1884. During his career, his work appears to have been well received, with observers calling him one of Pittsburgh's leading and most enterprising architects, acknowledging that he had an intelligent comprehension of the beautiful and the practical, and that he had created much notable work, lasting monuments to his genius, ability, and industry. By his own admission, as seen in this 1904 advertisement, he had designed over 30 churches for the Diocese of Pittsburgh. However, in the years after his death in 1942, assessments became more critical, with historians calling him conservative and uninspired, a minor league architect without imagination, and a rather prosaic designer. Digging into these negative assessments, less than a dozen of Sauer's works are ever mentioned. It appears that the authors were largely unaware of the thousands of other designs that Sauer had created. In one interesting example, respected critic Walter Kidney, who called Sauer a producer of colorless buildings, triumphs Sauer's design for St. Adalbert's Church on the south side, calling it a piece of architectural drama, unaware that Sauer was the architect. Among the most cited of Sauer's works is St. Stanislaus Kostka, constructed in 1892 for the Polish community of the Strip District. In the center is a drawing presumably created by Sauer's firm. Also noted frequently is St. Mary Magdalene in Homestead, although Walter Kidney and others only appear to be aware of its 1935 post-fire redesign by architect Paul McLean, shown in the bottom right. Also much discussed and usually praised are Sauer's designs for St. Mary of the Mount on Mount Washington and the Latimer School on the north side. But there are many more designs now known to us that should be considered in contemporary assessments of Sauer. For example, he designed a number of wood-framed parish churches for small communities, including Sacred Heart in Dawson and St. Anne's in Castle Shannon. And dozens of more monumental masonry churches in a variety of architectural styles and for a variety of denominations. Here we see St. Adalbert, that piece of architectural drama, along with Grace Evangelical Lutheran in Butler and Immaculate Conception in Connellsville. Sauer designed St. Joseph Church on the north side, Holy Name Church in Duquesne, and Transfiguration Church in Mount Pleasant. Here we see more of the breadth of styles in which Sauer worked, from the monumental, classically derived entrance to St. Francis de Sales and McKee's Rocks, to the Italian Renaissance-inspired campaniles of St. Leo's in Marshall Shadeland. But not every church was Gothic revival, but he could do that well also, as seen in St. Coleman's in Turtle Creek. Sauer was particularly adept at listening to the needs of each congregation and understanding their unique historical context, whether they be Polish, Croatian, or African American. In the center is Brown Chapel AME on the north side. Sauer also executed hundreds of designs that weren't ecclesiastical. Among his civic and institutional buildings was the Linden Club in Point Breeze that later became the East Liberty Academy, and schools in Cheswick, Tarentum, and McKee's Rocks. The types of buildings that Sauer designed was also broad and included municipal buildings like this one for North Braddock, a natatorium for East Liberty, and lodge halls for fraternal organizations, like two halls that he designed for Elks Lodge number 11 in Pittsburgh. Among his commercial work was the finely detailed terracotta-clad Zoch building on Wood Street downtown, and the Werner Building in East Liberty, also in terracotta. In 1916, he also created a new terracotta storefront to unify the look of two buildings owned by the May Stern department store. In addition to designing complete buildings in terracotta, Sauer is known to have designed a number of terracotta pieces that major manufacturers featured in their trade catalogs. On the right is one of my favorite details designed by Sauer. This is a cast concrete porte cochere from the county workhouse in Blawnox that illustrates his skill working with a broad range of materials, and also illustrates that he kept current with the latest technical advances. Among his multitude of residential commissions were houses in Highland Park, Aspinwall, and Delafield Heights. The latter, shown in the lower right, again illustrates Sauer's awareness of developing trends, as he has provided a prairie-influenced house with a broad low form and notable overhanging eaves. In the center is an example of Sauer's published works. This is a house he designed in McKeesport for E.E. Dearborn that appeared in Scientific American's Architects and Builders edition. He also designed apartment buildings as seen in the upper right with the Oaks Bates Apartments of 1910. Lastly, we have Sauer's own residential compound in Aspinwall that he created from 1898 until his death in 1942. It is a fantastical collection of buildings created largely for his own amusement and by his own hand. Returning to his early training in Germany, he served not only as designer, but also mason, bricklayer, and carpenter. By no means am I arguing that every one of these designs is a masterpiece. Some are obviously, even to the layperson, awkward and uninspired. But given how much new information exists, I hope that someone will take a deeper dive than I was able to undertake for my report and give Sauer a second look. In our few remaining minutes, I'd like to highlight the second main element of the historic structure report, the development of prioritized preservation recommendations. My first task was to measure and draw the building. This was an invaluable exercise that required me to access every part of the building and carefully document existing conditions. The result is a series of drawings from the basement to the roof. Among their uses will be showing camera positions for the dozens of photographs that will accompany the report. At the lower right is a view of the ceiling that will be used to create a visual key noting the locations, names, and dates of each of Vanka's murals. With the drawings in hand to mark down my observations, I was ready to begin my assessment. But before I go too far tonight and show a handful of the preservation challenges that I encountered, I'd like to preface this section by offering my conclusion that the church shows obvious signs of having been well maintained over the past century. I began literally from the ground up with a survey of the basement. On each floor, I looked for what I call the 3 C's: construction techniques, changes to the building over time, and the current condition of the spaces. An example of construction methods includes the impressions from wooden boards left on the ceiling. They had served as formwork for the concrete floor when it was poured overhead. One condition of note was some water infiltration on the school side of the basement, where I am recommending that cameras be sent through the underground roof drainage to determine if century-old drain pipes might have collapsed. Everywhere I went, I looked for unwanted water, the cause of the vast majority of preservation problems. As seen in the previous photo, water problems do not just originate from the roof. On the first floor, my assessment included both the interior and exterior of the building. I noted failing paint that had been applied to foundation stones, a practice that is generally not advisable since moisture can actually be trapped behind the paint layer. I also looked for any area where the mortar between the bricks might have failed and could be allowing water to enter. For the most part, the brickwork appears to be in sound condition. One construction technique worth noting is the inside surface of the doors to the sacristies on either side of the altar, which were painted a century ago in a faux finish that involved special paintbrushes, special paints, and combs that were used to simulate wood grain as a decorative element. I also examined the windows, and through my research was able to determine that the main windows of the nave had been created by Homestead stained glass artist Joseph Herzog. Herzig, it should say. They were dedicated in 1941 at the same celebration that honored the completion of Vanka's second set of murals. The windows are in good condition and have been regularly maintained by Hunt Studio, which itself has designed some windows for the church. In this image from one of the tower rooms on the second floor, you can better understand the wall construction of the church. There are 3 layers of brick, then a layer of plaster, then paint. The particular damage shown here is old and is not the result of any current problem. It just reflects an accumulation of debris because this is a difficult area to reach. On the right is another example where water infiltration has impacted some of the decorative elements. This time, I do suspect that the water infiltration is from overhead. Fortunately, the church is already well ahead of my recommendations and planning repairs. I also climbed into attic areas of the church. On the left is the bell tower closest to the school, which still houses the original bells along with their more contemporary loudspeaker replacement. Conditions here were good and reflect some well-planned prior interventions to add screens and louvers to keep moisture and pests out. On the right in the main attic, you can see the top side of the vaulted ceiling. You're looking at plaster that has been pushed through wire lath. The red arrow points to a series of missing bricks that likely date back to the construction details of the first church, where the holes anchored wooden ceiling members into the brick wall. The recommendation is simply to infill with brick to provide lasting stability. The last part of my assessment was the roof, arguably the most important element for protecting a building. This diagram highlights a few areas of concern, including a design issue at letter A, where water can accumulate up against the tower walls. At B is the failed waterproofing I mentioned at the tops of the window arches. C shows a potentially failing box gutter, and D points out the recommendation to send cameras into the underground drainage. And since I don't know everything, I engaged 2 engineers to assist me. My thanks go out to John Schneider, structural engineer at Gateway Engineers, and Jonathan Iams, mechanical, electrical, and plumbing engineer at Iams Consulting. They both assessed existing conditions and provided recommendations that will be part of my report. I hope that you found all of this to be interesting, and I welcome any questions, corrections, or additions to the compelling story of the significance and preservation of St. Nicholas. And please remember to forward any historic photos. Thank you.
It was wonderful, Jeff. So we have a couple questions, but before we get to that, I thought that we'd go and do another poll. So appearing before you guys now will be another poll about how many people are past or present members of St. Nick's. And if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask, please be sure to type them into the either Q&A box or the chat function, and I'll read them off to Jeff and we can kind of go through some of them. Looks like we've got quite a few responses so far. Right then, so we have still a few coming in then. So looks like quite a lot, about almost a 20%, 80% spread, 80% not having any past or present members of St. Nicholas, and 20% or 18% having. So Jeff, there's a couple questions that came up through, and actually they're coming in now as well, but through the course of your lecture. And I was wondering if you can expand a bit on some of the questions that were asked then. The first is, were there any of the religious relics within the church that exist today, such as the statues, altarpieces, or crucifixes? Do any of those date back to the original St. Nicholas Church before the fire?
It's a great question, and it's one that I've always thought about as I visit the church each time. Going back to the photo of the fire in 1921, if you compare this to the present church, you will see that the altars are not the same. Mm-hmm. One newspaper account of the fire says that the statue of Mary was miraculously untouched. So I'm not sure yet if that has survived and is still in the church today. But almost everything appears to have been damaged and subsequently replaced. The only stained glass that I think remains from the original 1900 church is actually shown in this photograph. The two arched doorways to the side sacristies have a leaded glass transom, and I believe that those date to the first church, but none of the other windows.
Now, in the picture that you have up before us too, I mean, it looks like in the apse, there's kind of the faint traces of a mural that wraps the altar. Were you able to find any clear documentation of what that mural was, what was depicted?
Unfortunately, I have not. And there are no other known interior photos from the first church. But I agree with you that it does look like there are gatherings of people painted on the wall on either side of the altar. I did, in my research, discover one tantalizing possibility that during the early part of the 20th century, around the time that the first church was being constructed, there was a fresco painter of some national renown who actually lived in Millville, but I have not been able to connect him in any way to the church. So a lot of the details of the original church remain to be discovered.
And there's another question too about whether or not there are plans to do a restoration of the dome. And I'd wonder if you would like to comment on that as well, and maybe do it through considering the lens of how things kind of enter into the National Register, and how, when you look at a building, you're able to determine what parts relate back to which piece of history, and how it conveys significance.
Sure. So in historic preservation, one of the things that we establish is what's called the period of significance. That is the time period during which the events occurred that make the building important. When the National Register was written for the church, it obviously referenced the murals. So that period of significance would start in 1937. I would argue that a second period of significance would include the full history of the church for the importance of telling the Croatian immigrant story. And you could also then argue that Father Žagar, as I went over tonight, was extremely significant to the development of the church, and possibly architect Frederick Sauer. Now that the building has been established as being nationally significant, there would be a very stringent process involved if there were going to be major changes, such as rebuilding the dome. I will preface that by saying that None of those are required at the moment by any type of preservation body. Even though the building is listed on the National Register, that does not require that there be any kind of review of plans, and it does not in any way tie the hands of the owner. If you wanted to paint the church pink, one could. The worst that would happen is that it might not remain on the National Register. So the short answer is that unless there were a compelling reason to reestablish a feature like the dome, my recommendation would be to maintain the church based on the current period of significance, which emphasizes the murals and the Croatian immigrant story. It would be extraordinarily expensive to put that dome back on the building. And at this point, damage would be done to the murals on the ceiling by the introduction of that large circular opening.
A couple other questions as well. What is the present condition of the school? And could you, through your research, give us a little idea of what grades were present in the school while it was active?
I don't know as much about the school as I would like. I have not been in it. It was beyond the scope of my work, which is focusing on the church, except to look at the developmental history of the entire campus. But I found it, as I discussed tonight, to be an important part of the legacy of Father Jagar and that modernist vision that he had for the campus atop Bennett's Hill. So I'm not sure of a lot more details, like how the building was used and what grades were there and things like that. I believe it stopped being a church around 1980, or school around 1980 or 1982. And I'm not sure what is in store for its future, but I would encourage an examination of uses that would keep Father Jagar's modernist vision intact.
And then I think we have time for one other question, which is actually it's of particular interest to me. What was on the walls between the rebuilding in 1922 and the start of the Vanka Murals in 1937?
The only thing that I have read is one account of them being painted white. So I think that the church really had to be frugal after the fire. Their insurance policy did not cover the full rebuilding of the church as it was originally constructed. And so we see that there were very simple windows put in that were just clear textured glass. The walls were painted white, the dome was not put back, and it took 20 years to save up the money for new stained glass windows for the nave.
Now, I know that it's somewhat common to kind of rededicate buildings when there's a kind of tragedy such as this, and as part of that rededication, that sometimes they'll include a kind of a time capsule. You know, have you come across any sort of dedication or any sort of memorial to that?
I have not. I've not read or seen where that might occur. The one possibility would be its incorporation into the cornerstone, which is seen in the right-hand image on the left side of the door. And that cornerstone still remains in place today. It survived the fire. And in 1969, when the current front vestibule and flanking rooms were created, that exterior space of the cornerstone became part of an interior room. But I don't believe or know that it holds any secrets.
And then there's one last question, and it might not be something that you're familiar with, but I'm going to put it on your radar because it sounds like an interesting kind of thread of history. There's a question from Joe and Cheryl McLaughlin. It says that the chapel at the top of St. Stanislaus Cemetery has a plaque on the back, and that they haven't looked at it in quite some time or could recall the exact wording, but the plaque, I think, clearly expresses some discontent with the reorganization of the diocese in regard to the local parishes. Is this something with which you're familiar or could comment on?
I'm not sure the date of this plaque, but there was definite tension and factional infighting when the two St. Nicholas congregations were first created. In fact, at the time of the fire, newspaper articles immediately suggested that it might have been arson and that the congregation on East Ohio Street should be suspected. I never found anything that ended up supporting that. But there has been a long history of infighting between the two congregations, and then also a long history of discontent where in each of these Croatian parishes, the parishioners, and I think rightfully so, wanted to have a Croatian priest, and they did not sit still if a priest who did not speak their language and could not understand them was put in charge of their church. So there are emotional histories with both of these parishes, and I would like to have more information about that plaque so that I could go take a look at it.
Wonderful. Well, Jeff, I again have to thank you for all the research that you've been able to provide us and go through today. I'd also just like to take a moment to thank everyone again for coming, and that we'll be sending out a survey shortly, and we'd love to hear from you on this topic and other topics that may be of interest. So thanks again, everyone, and have a wonderful evening.
Great. Thank you, everybody.